you spending a crazy amount of time trying to balance the perfect combat encounters for your players and wondering if there's a better way than D&D or Pathfinder's challenge rating systems? Well, there is, and all you have to do is one thing. Don't. But defeat! Your D&D combat feels off because you're playing the game like it's basketball instead of the fast-paced, chaotic cluster truck that only tabletop RPGs can emulate. But in this video, we're going to learn the difference between the two philosophies of tabletop RPG combat, why your table might prefer one over the other, and at the end, I'll show you a secret mechanic that you can incorporate into any tabletop game to make your fights more dynamic. You have been fighting in an uphill battle when it comes to designing game balance. But it's not your fault, because the game rules teach you that the best way to create enjoyable conflicts and combats for your players is by following formulas like challenge rating to perfectly balance the appropriate number and power level of the antagonists. You incorporate things like battle maps that contain your combat into beautifully drawn set pieces. And at first, you think all is well because you grew up playing video games that are chained down by the same limitations. It takes a few years, a few campaigns, and you have a good time, don't get me wrong. But the amount of time it takes to find or create the perfect map, calculate the XP budgets of your optimized party, realizing that the challenge rating system doesn't take into account magic items or unique monster abilities, and then during the game, your players either wipe the floor with the challenging encounter or get their butts handed to them by the easy encounter, and well, it's no wonder there's so many DM burnout videos. Preparing combat in this way is like trying to coordinate a fair pick-up-and-play game of basketball. I know, this is a nerd channel, just let me cook with this metaphor for a moment. In a friendly game of basketball, not only is there a defined space of gameplay and an even number of players on each team, but most pick-up-and-play groups will try to keep the same skill level between both teams as balanced as possible. If one team keeps dominating, you'll swap around the players. This is how games like D&D want you to think about combat, as if it's a sport. Here's the scene, here's the setup, here's the scientific formula, and if you players want to win in this combat, all you need to do is have a good understanding of the rules and push the right paper buttons at the right time. Like a video game. Conquering the challenge of a balanced game simply requires looking down at the character sheet and the grid lines on the battle map. And this is a perfectly fine way of playing. If you love preparing or playing combat as sport, great. But if you hate it, awesome. You'll love this next part. But regardless, your fun is valid. You play however you want. But I'm not playing basketball. I'm playing adult pretend with dice in a world I stole from so many sources it's starting to look original. Combats aren't always going to be 5v5. Sometimes it's more like 5v5d6 goblins, and their point guard is an 8-foot-tall ogre magi. But my players don't call foul. My players win this basketball game by kiting the goblins to a nearby soccer field. That's actually an illusion cast by the wizard over the height, while the ranger who's been camping in the nosebleed starts picking off the stragglers, who are lucky enough to make their saving throw against the semi-truck. The fighter commandeered to separate the goblins from the ogre magi, who's currently coming to the realization that the Gatorade they ritually chugged before every basketball game was poisoned by the rogue, with a compound she acquired 3 sessions ago from a special flower I, the GM, once briefly mentioned could suppress all magical abilities if ingested. This is combat as war. If combat as sport is playing by the character sheet and the game rules, combat as war is playing by the game world and rulings. This means your world isn't fair. This means that while the game might revolve around your players, the other characters and monsters in your game don't ask at what player level do they get to start existing. Does that mean I just shrug my shoulders if I roll up a hill giant in the moment my players step outside the town? No, they're smart. You know the more dangerous the threat, the more warning shots you need to take. But you and I also know that if you did roll up a hill giant outside of town and the players poke at it, you're going to let that series of bad decisions play out. I choose my monsters on what makes sense in the game world rather than what some challenge rating tells me I'm allowed to use. Challenge rating is more like napkin math rather than this perfected formula I was first led to believe. Your job, among many, as a game master is to provide problems, not solutions. And trying to balance an encounter or fight is trying to solve the problem before it's even presented to the players. When you start treating the game world believably, the monsters and NPCs act like living creatures. That means when it comes to life or death situations, they're going to use every trick in the stat block and then some. Ask any grognard what a Tucker's kobold is and watch them as they either grin or shudder. But treating combat as war goes for both sides of the screen. But I don't use DM screens, so... Fragile. Huh. Dear Deficient Master, enclosed is our crafted prototype of the Frontier Workshop Game Master's Chest, a DM screen that allows you to... Deficient! You said you don't like to use DM screens! Oh, yeah, I did. I just don't think they're that I'm having second thoughts. Frontier Workshop is expanding into tabletop RPGs with their new Game Master's Chest Kickstarter, a customizable mobile kit for tabletop on the go. Inside contains enough space for 2 coffee table tomes. Or 4 of these bad boys. Magnetized shelves and interior for your miniatures, notes, and initiative trackers. Storage boxes for dice and notes. And my personal favorite, it has it all. But you can also carry your chest in this stylish canvas bag. Ooh. Such a handsome model, modeling such a handsome bag. The Game Master's Chest Kickstarter is launching later this month, so reserve your chest in the description below. Thank you, Frontier Workshop, for sponsoring this video and putting my face on your chest, even though I specifically requested you to engrave this picture. As I was saying, combat as war applies to the other side of the DM screen as well, players. I used to fall into this mentality that once initiative was rolled, I was locked into whatever my character could do on my character sheet and where the battle map told me I was allowed to go. But when your DM starts treating combat as war, you have to fight unfair too. Not by cheating in the game rules, but by cheating in the game world. But if you're interested in adopting a combat as war philosophy, this switch comes with a few caveats. First, tell your table a quick, hey, I'm no longer looking into making sure everything's balanced to your level can be enough. But what you need to stress within your game to the players is that they too must play their combat as war. This means you need to give the players options. If your game notes say anything along the lines of this creature attacks on sight and fights to the death, and it's not a zombie or a dwarf toddler, then you're just going to see the players get killed more frequently playing combat as war. Allow the players options and avenues of avoiding or even circumventing fights altogether, should they wish. And because you're not wasting time calculating challenge rating, it doesn't hurt when they skip your fights. Playing combat as war also means the value of information skyrockets. If your fights tend to fall into the more kicking down door, kill monster, repeat sort of cycle, your players will be more at a disadvantage. So create ways to allow players to acquire information about their opponents through spying, bribing, researching, or asking questions to NPCs. Give players ways to find out what's in the monster stat block without just handing them the monster manual. Because in combat as war, everything within the world now matters. There is no such thing as set dressing. Fights can be dragged or lured into other rooms. A fireball can cave in the ceiling above or drop the floor into the room below. Walls might be more of a suggestion now instead of a barrier. Everyone starts looking up for chandeliers to swing or curtains to throw. You might start finding them battle maps rather constricting, as now anything can be used both for and against the players. With all of this potential chaos, you're going to have to get comfortable making up rulings in the moment. Because that's the reason you exist, GM, to determine what happens when your players and your world start doing things that ain't in the rulebook. You'll have to have an answer when the players want to know how many dice should we roll for a falling piano? D8s? D10s? The correct answer is the one you and your fellow players agree on together. Regardless if you prefer combat as war or combat as sport, there's a secret mechanic that nobody seems to be using in their modern games, even though it's right there in the 5e Dungeon Master's Guide. What if I told you that there was a game mechanic that creates more opportunity for your players to overcome a fight without even rolling a single attack roll? What if I told you this mechanic alone has made my combats more dynamic beyond a hit it till it dies strategy? What if I told you that this mechanic alone saved my marriage? It's morale. Morale was an optional mechanic in both the older editions and in 5e, but the incorporation of morale was more prevalent in earlier games because every monster and creature had a morale score in their stat block. In the earlier editions, that morale score was anywhere between 2 and 12, and the GM would roll a 2d6 when the first enemy went down or when half the opposition was defeated, or in whatever circumstance the GM felt would cause a morale check. If you rolled equal or less than the morale rating, the bad guys kept fighting. If higher, the morale was broken, and they started running. And if they couldn't run, they'd surrender. 5e has slotted this rule well towards the back of their DMG. But I use morale in all of my games, as it alters the tactics for both sides of the screen. A retreating enemy can warn other enemies. A retreating enemy can move the battle into a new room or environment. A surrendered opponent can now provide some opportunity to roleplay to collect valuable information. But these mechanics won't stand on their own unless you incorporate this next piece of advice right here. As always, a salute to the Coffee Masters, keeping up my own morale. Thank you, Frontier Workshop, for sponsoring this video. Check out their Kickstarter below, but that's all I've got for now. See ya!